Okay, so you just talked about that the China's trade surplus exceeded 1
Yeah,
trillion.
yeah,
Um, it is unprecedented in terms of the absolute terms, 1 trillion. But actually, the big share, I think during the Song Dynasty, China's export probably is in the neighborhood of a third of the world trade.
yeah,
And certainly in the Qing Dynasty, the sea trade was about a third and going
yeah,
about a third trade going through Guangzhou alone. So,
yeah.
so that's not unprecedented,
No,
right?
it is not unprecedented. I mean, it is unprecedented in the modern industrialized world.
Okay.
But then, of course, if you know about the Song Dynasty, which of course is the period of China that I am most informed about because it
Hmm.
was the one that I am most interested in. I mean, I collect paintings of that time.
Hmm.
And I know the history of the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty was on the brink of industrialization. China was at that time very, very close to industrialization. In some sectors, as in porcelain manufacturing, it achieved it. The Chinese were the first people to create modern industrial lines
Hmm.
and modern methods of industrialization. They had proper monetary policy, which nobody else did at that time. They had paper money, which was real paper money. I mean, they had absolutely proper modern, understandably modern systems of economic organization. I mean, the reason it didn't happen, and it's very simple, is because there was the invasion by the various northern people, the
Hmm.
Liao
Hmm.
and the
Yeah, yeah.
Tsin,
Jin, yeah.
and eventually the Mongols.
Yeah.
So I mean, it was the the external pressures that prevented this process from achieving fruition. And if you were to go anywhere in the world in around say 1000 AD, at the time of the heyday of the Sung Dynasty, I mean, you just said to yourself, this place is, I mean, enormously far
Hmm.
ahead of anywhere else. And I suspect that at that time, the Chinese economy probably accounted for a bigger share of
Hmm.
world GDP than it does today.
Yeah.
And probably in terms of trade, I mean, it's exactly the point that you have just made. And the same is true of the Qing dynasty as well.
Mhm.
I mean, it was a tragedy, not just for China, but for humankind.
Yeah.
And China was evolving in all sorts of interesting ways. I mean, it was developing its political system. The position of the Huangdi was changing.
Hmm.
The society was becoming a further away from militarism. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I could talk about this for hours. The point is that you're absolutely correct. What has happened is that China has returned to its historic position within the global economy. It has
Hmm.
always been technologically, industrially, in terms of manufacturing, extremely advanced, and it has always accounted for an enormous share of world trade.
One of the things some articles are talking about is the Chinese yuan is undervalued. The part they contribute that to the success of the export, exceeding 1 trillion, that Chinese goods are so competitive
Yeah,
because it provides good values, right? It's good quality and low price. And that the low price comes with the undervalued yuan. At the same time, I have to say, I'm not sure the United States really want China to strengthen the Chinese yuan because for a simple reason, because the GDP is using the current exchange rate, one
yeah,
to seven, right? Now, if the yuan strengthens, the Chinese GDP without doing anything, it will go up,
absolutely.
right? I don't want to. I don't think the US wants that.
No, absolutely. I mean, you make an absolutely excellent point. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, I had a discussion with somebody about the Russian currency, which goes up and down, much more so. I mean, it goes up and down like a yo-yo, far more so than the Chinese. Well, the Chinese yuan doesn't.
Hmm.
There's been more of a stabilization recently, but anyway, the Russians have what they call a dirty exchange rate. They do this on purpose. So because they want to maintain a trade surplus, they keep their currency going up and down, much more so than China does. But anyway, he was telling me, there's the proofs that Russia's economy is contracting, and the fact that the currency is falling. And I said there was the previous year, the Russian economy, rather the Russian currency strengthened. If you use GDP, the GDP figures based on exchange rates, then that means that in that year, the Russian economy grew by 14%. Is that what you're telling me? I remember that. I remember that discussion. And needless to say, he became very angry when I said that, which is what all people always do. But you're absolutely right. If China floated its exchange rate, two things would quickly happen. Three things would happen. Firstly, the exchange rate would go up. It would strengthen. Secondly, that would mean that there would be a massive investment surge because money all around the world would flood into China. It would suck up investment from all around the world. Thirdly, the Chinese trade surplus would quickly restabilize. They would stabilize at the higher exchange rate because the exchange rate is not the big factor in the Chinese trade surplus that people imagine it is. It would not be good for China to do that because it would, if you have an investment surge, you have hot money pouring into the country, that creates all kinds of volatility and instability. It would do all sorts of things. It would, in fact, be very close to what you saw happen to Japan in the 1980s. We discussed the Plaza Accord. So China's absolutely right not to do that. But it would not have the effect that many people assume it would. And it's not the reason for China's tremendous export boom. I mean, this is a bad argument anyway, because it assumes that there is some technical reason for a country's enormous strength in technology, manufacturing, and industry. Technical matters are the kind of things that a government should anyway be doing in order to make economies strong. All it tells you is that the Chinese government knows what it's doing, ultimately.
Okay, so let's talk about this U.S. National Security Strategy 2025, which got lots of attention. There's a huge amount of discussion in the Chinese social media and some comments from the Western mainstream media. Now, it seems like a lot of people saying that this is Trump's versions of the Monroe Doctrine and some kind of a strategic retreat. I'm not so sure. Okay, so let's walk it through a little bit. So, first of all, there is one paragraph that said this, which I'm a little bit puzzled. It says President Trump's foreign policy is pragmatic without being pragmatist, realistic without being realist, principled without being idealistic, muscular without being hawkish. Why being pragmatist and realist is a bad thing? Why do they emphasize that?
Well, you tell me. I mean, it basically, what it's basically saying, because there is a realist school of foreign policy, and which is actually pragmatic, and they're saying that that's not really what they're about at all. This is a very, very strange document, by the way. I mean, it makes some acknowledgements of the realities of the modern world. It accepts that China today is a great power and a great economy and all of that. It's very, very hostile to China. I mean, I think people understate how hostile to China this document actually, in fact, is. It clearly sees China as the great rival, and it talks about Taiwan in ways that I think people in China ought to be concerned, because it basically makes at the very least the status quo. It wants to see the status quo In other words, this situation where Taiwan maintains a kind of, well, let's call it independence. Even if but you understand, I'm not talking about legal independence, but at least it's not part of the governmental system in China. Anyway, it wants to maintain that indefinitely.
Yeah.
And ultimately, you get the sense that it would prefer that Taiwan went independent entirely. It does not want Taiwan fully reunited with the homeland. I mean, it clearly doesn't. And there's something else that it says. It says that the United States must not allow any country, and of course, the only country it means is China, to become more powerful than itself. So it's setting the conditions for future conflict with China. And it talks about retrenchment. It talks about ending the forever wars. It talks about not getting bogged down in the Middle East. But what it really means is that it wants a secure American sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, where, by the way, it is careful to say that external players, and again, it means China, should not be allowed. It doesn't even want economic contacts between Latin American states and China. There's even a passage which talks about the importance for the United States replacing China. It is clearly China that is meant as the main economic partner of all of the Latin American states. And bear in mind, that includes Brazil. Okay. So Brazil, which is a big country, but it must be subordinate and controlled by the United States. So it wants this enormous sphere of influence totally under America's thumb. And it wants a stabilization, as it calls it, of the situation in Europe. And that means a stabilization of the relationship with Russia. But the only reason why it wants that actually is so that it can focus on China instead. I mean, this is what this is all about. It is not, as many people say, an attempt to retreat or an attempt to pull back or to come to some kind of understanding with China. It is intended to put the United States in a stronger position so that it can pursue a very aggressive rivalry with China. I am sure that the Chinese government, who have been reading this, are not fooled about this at all.
Yeah. Well, like there are certain parts of it is pretty obvious to me. Like here it says for a country whose interests are, now the country means the United States, for a country whose interests are numerous and diverse as ours, rigid adherence to non-interventionism is not possible. To me, that means that it will continue to do regime change operations, right?
Yes.
So that's not a retreat.
No. I mean, it's even hinting now at wanting to do regime change operations in Europe. It speaks about supporting some political forces in Europe against others, just to say. But no, you're absolutely correct. It's adjusting priorities. It accepts that the pursuit of American world domination, and it uses the word domination, interestingly, but it accepts that the pursuit of American world domination is now beyond America's reach. It doesn't use the word world domination, but it still wants the United States to remain number one, and it still sees China as a rival and an adversary. And it's absolutely prepared to use the full toolkit that the United States has perfected over the last, 80 years. Regime changes, color revolutions, internal subversion. It's absolutely prepared to use it in order to maintain control. Actually, this is a much more cynical document than what you would get from the so-called realist school. It's spheres of influence, great powers, an attempt. You could see it to play Russia off against China, to undermine China in all kinds of ways, to push it out of Latin America, for example. And ultimately with the objective that even if we can't dominate the world, we must still remain the strongest, biggest, richest country. That's I mean, it's absolutely explicit about that, by the
Yeah.
way.
Well, it says here, we will work with allies and partners to maintain global and regional balances of the power to prevent the emergence of dominant adversaries. That's pretty clear, right?
Yeah,
It's just
absolutely.
China
Yeah.
cannot be adversary
Yeah.
who? China, of
Yes.
course.
Yes.
So what is the
There is never any suggestion of a true, genuine partnership and friendship with China.
Mhm,
There is
mhm.
no hint of that in this document.
No. What it is slightly different from the previous, I guess, if you compare Trump with Biden, probably is they talked a lot about the burden sharing. So allies need to, I guess, pay the United States more to
Yes.
maintain the United
Yes.
States being the dominant power, right? So that's where it says it did make it very clear. Allies, they need to pay more. They need to contribute
Yeah.
more.
Absolutely, because the United States, despite all the claims and bragging about how it remains the most powerful country with the best economy and the best financial system and all of that, understands perfectly well that it cannot take on China by itself. So it wants to enlist all its allies to do that for it. And by the way, we did a program about this on the Duran,
Mhm.
Alex and I, and we discussed this at length. And this is exactly what empires that are in decline, I should stress Western
Mhm.
colonial
Mhm.
empires, when they are in decline, tend to do. There are two immediate examples that spring up. The first was Britain,
Mhm.
when the British, and we discussed this at length in our program, the British, again in the 1890s and early 1900s, when they sensed that their power was ebbing, started to tell the members of the British Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, that now the time had come for them to share the burden with Britain. And they also said the United States should join in and share the burden with Britain to keep the Anglo-Saxon, the English-speaking nations, at the top. And the other big example of this is the Romans. Again, going back all that way, there's a famous, to any classical historian, there's a famous letter that the emperor sent to the British cities in 400 AD as the empire was starting to weaken, in which he said that I have to, pull back the army to basically do other things. From now on, you must take on responsibility for your own defense.
Mhm.
So empires, when they start to weaken, they start to look to their allies, and maybe one shouldn't call them allies, they're vassals, they're
Mhm.
satellites, to take the burden off their shoulders, to lighten the burden on them.
And in terms of Asia, it's clearly stated leading from a position of strength, meaning United States will
Yeah.
lead, right? So continue to
Yes.
lead.
Yes.
So yeah.